Hey gang, didn't expect to be talking to you from my kitchen living room-ish. As you can see, I still have my Christmas tree up. I usually leave it up through January because we always have snow in January and it's kind of nice to have a Christmas tree. But anyway, so I'm going to have to revise what I was going to teach today because in large part I was going to try to get us caught up from last week's virtual lessons. So, I'm going to revise a little bit, and we're going to kind of finish up with George Washington today. And I know you've already read ahead through Thomas Jefferson, so I've got Washington, Adams, and Jefferson to cover. So today, what I would like to do is just to kind of wrap up George Washington's presidency. I still will, when I see you tomorrow, we'll kind of hit on some of the main topics of his presidency. But for today's purposes, I want to kind of focus in on his farewell address. So as you guys know, he served 2 terms, and it became very apparent to him with his age and partisanship between the 2 political parties that it was time for him to step aside, go home to Mount Vernon, enjoy his final years at home. He had spent so many years away from home, get Mount Vernon kind of back in working order, and he also felt it was pretty important for him to pass the baton for the country to see the peaceful transfer of power. It was very critical. So in his case, he is going to be passing the baton on to somebody in his own political party. But when John Adams leaves office, he's going to pass the baton peacefully to the Democratic Republicans and Thomas Jefferson. So in AP, George Washington's farewell address is pretty important. It's one of those words or one of those primary documents. I decided I'm not going to have you read the actual document. It's written in Old English, Shakespeare-ish. It's really hard to understand. It's sort of like the Federalist Papers. And so what I did is I found a summary of it on the Mount Vernon website. And essentially tells you the article is about 3 pages long, and it covers the main points of Washington's farewell address, which he actually, if I understand correctly, did not deliver in person. It was printed in the newspapers. I think the country was really surprised that he was stepping aside because he probably could have served till he died. James Madison had originally written parts of it because I think Washington tinkered around with the idea of stepping aside after the first term, but then when he served a second term, he asked his close confidant, Alexander Hamilton, to put it together. Or to write it, with the things that were important to him, the messages he wanted to get across. And so the content is his heart, written largely by Alexander Hamilton and in part by James Madison, which is interesting. So there are several very important points he tries to make in it, but he warns the country about partisanship to the 2-party political system. He had seen how that had fleshed out in person between Hamilton and Jefferson and how ugly it was. He warns about foreign entanglement. As you know, Washington was a big proponent of neutrality, especially in regards to the wars that were happening in Europe between the British and the French. He also talks about being careful about spending too much money, being in debt, and those sorts of things. So anyway, I want you to read the article, the summary of it from the website. I'll upload the Word document. There is also, I want you to actually go to the website where I found the article, and there's about a 5-minute video summary by a United States Senator, I think his name's Tim Kaine, that talks about the significance of Washington's farewell address historically and specifically to the United States Senate. I had kind of forgotten this, but apparently George Washington's farewell address is read from the floor of the United States Senate on or around Washington's birthday every year as a reminder to them of the important messages that were contained in the speech. So I want you to watch that little 5-minute video as well. I was going to show you a song from Hamilton called One Last Time. It's George Washington's kind of farewell song. It's really, really powerful. The actor in Hamilton actually incorporates portions of the actual speech, or the farewell address, which is really interesting. And so I can't find a copy of it online. Anyway, I'm just going to show it to you in class tomorrow. So it's only like 4 minutes long. So I'll show it to you in class tomorrow. And then lastly, I'm just going to go through the summary questions from period 3B, which you'll be turning in tomorrow now. I think it's numbers 11, 12, 13, and 14. So just bear with me. I'm just going to zip through these really quickly. Number 11 says, actually I need to enlarge this because I can't hardly read it. Number 11 says, what philosophical differences about government were exposed by the actions of the farmers in Pennsylvania and the actions of the federal government during the Whiskey Rebellion? I'm looking at this for the first time in a very long time. So right off the top of my head, the farmers sort of adopted the attitude that you can't tax us, sort of the no taxation without representation attitude of the American Revolution. However, this was a different situation because the people's elected representatives had actually voted for this excise tax. And so while at the state level, they rejected the idea that the federal government had the power and ability to tax them. However, at the federal level, Congress had passed this law. And so you see a little bit of struggle between regional state power and the federal power. This is also a regional thing as well. The middle states and the southern states resented the fact that they felt like a lot of the tax burden ended up falling to them to fund the federal government. So that's kind of at the top of my head. You may have written some other things. We can talk about that as well. Number 12 says, what effect did the Treaty of Greenville have on the Native Americans? And so the Treaty of Greenville comes after the Battle of Fallen Timbers, when Mad Anthony defeated the Northwest Confederacy following St. Clair's defeat. And so it set in motion the idea that the tribes would be defeated militarily, the U.S. government would pay them a stipend for their land, and then they set up this annuity system in which the government promised to provide sometimes money, sometimes food, sometimes clothing, that sort of thing, in exchange for the Indians agreeing to stay within a designated area. And that becomes the pattern all across the country. The federal government is going to violate a lot of their principles, as well as the Indians are going to hunt off their land. Settlers are going to move on to Indian land. Nobody stands up to their end of the deal, and it becomes pretty consequential, obviously, for the Native Americans, who ultimately are going to pretty much lose everything. The whole situation was not handled very well, but the Treaty of Greenville sets into motion that policy towards Native Americans. Number 13, moves on to the John Adams presidency. What was the XYZ affair, and how did it lead to the quasi-war with France in 1797? All right, so George Washington had a policy of neutrality. The Jay's Treaty settled any outstanding worry or fear of war with the British by basically forging a peace treaty and agreement. And then the French, John Adams, who's now dealing with the same situation, the French, he wants to forge a peace treaty with the French. America's trying to trade with the British and the French. They're wanting America to pick sides. We've got a peace treaty with the British. Now we want to get one with the French. Now the French are a little bit in chaos. They're trying to find their way through the crazy, and they're going to dive into a lot of crazy here shortly. But John Adams sends John Marshall and some other diplomats to France to secure a peace negotiation or treaty, with French Foreign Minister Talleyrand. When they get there, Talleyrand refuses to see them, and some French representatives of his government show up and essentially bribe the American ambassadors. They don't use their names. The Americans don't use the French diplomats' names. They just call them French X, Y, and Z. Frenchman X, Frenchman Y, Frenchman Z, and they are very offended by this affront to their diplomatic prowess, and they throw a fit, and John Marshall comes back to the United States and says, this is what they wanted. They wanted this much money. They wanted us to continue to pay them money to negotiate with their foreign minister, and it was extremely offensive. John Adams was horrified. I don't know how it's kind of like a belittling, treating America as a second-rate nation. And so anyway, John Adams felt like it was almost an act of war. Like, okay, do you want war with us? Because we don't want war with you. So he begins to prepare for war. He considers enlarging the Navy. He actually does move forward to raise up a standing army, which he's going to ask George Washington to command with the assistance of Alexander Hamilton. It's crazy. He approaches his Vice President, Thomas Jefferson, because Jefferson has a relationship with the French, thinking that Thomas Jefferson perhaps can put out the fire a little bit and talk some sense into the French. Well, so when he shows Thomas Jefferson all of the correspondence between X, Y, and Z and John Marshall, Thomas Jefferson almost acts like that there's no way this is real. Talleyrand would never do this. I think this is just an excuse to go to war with France. He takes the French side and he questions the legitimacy of the story. John Adams is, of course, just like, are you kidding me? And so what ultimately ends up happening in regards to this is that this moves the United States towards a legislative policy of sort of discriminating against French Americans, French immigration. What once was all things, all love, we love the French, all because they helped us in the American Revolution, takes this wicked turn, and all of a sudden Americans become very anti-French, which to much dismay of Thomas Jefferson. The Alien and Sedition Acts, which is question number 14, the alien part of those acts essentially raised the number of years a French person had to be in the United States before they could become a citizen. It was an attempt to prevent French people from voting. French Americans tended to vote for the Democratic Republicans, John Adams trying to secure the Federalist Party, but also there's a lot of anti-French sentiment in the country, and so Americans were okay with that. The sedition part of the Alien and Sedition Acts criminalized free speech. Anybody that was speaking out against John Adams' ideals of raising up an army to prepare for war with the French became treasonous conversation, treasonous talk. And so you could actually be arrested for speaking out against the government's policy towards the French. In fact, there were a number of newspaper editors and publishers that were arrested and thrown in prison for speaking seditiously against John Adams for his anti-French actions. And so it kind of pits the two parties against one another again. The Democratic Republicans are historically pro-French. The Federalists are typically pro-British. And so Thomas Jefferson, this is kind of really important part of this, Thomas Jefferson as vice president tells John Adams if he signs this bill, this Alien and Sedition Acts, that he will be violating the Bill of Rights, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, etc. It will be an act against the Constitution, and he would be forced to go to, I think it was Virginia and Kentucky, he and James Madison, and introduce bills of nullification. Essentially what that means is Thomas Jefferson and James Madison were going to encourage Southern states who were not so anti-French to nullify a federal law, essentially saying we don't have to obey that federal law because it's unconstitutional. Well, you guys know that it is not the role of state governments to determine what laws are constitutional and what laws are not unconstitutional. That is a federal court issue. States can't just indiscriminately say, I don't like this federal law, so I'm not gonna abide by it. I don't like this law. And ultimately all roads lead to slavery. Someday if the North is going to outlaw slavery, if the federal government is going to outlaw slavery, Southern states are going to nullify that law. And ultimately the Civil War is sort of a nullification process. Anyway, we'll get to that later. But Thomas Jefferson threatens to lead a charge against his own president as vice president to nullify federal laws that have been signed into law by the President of the United States. So Thomas Jefferson leaves Washington, D.C. I don't think he ever comes back. He spends the last couple of years of John Adams' presidency back at his home in Monticello. He throws up his hands. He's kind of a quitter. The nullification process in those state legislatures doesn't end up going very far because John Adams loses re-election and Thomas Jefferson becomes president, and he essentially introduces to Congress a law to reverse the Alien and Sedition Acts. And so the nullification crisis, as it was called, never comes to fruition because Thomas Jefferson is elected president and he reverses course. So, all right, so nullification is a huge AP word. XYZ affair, this quasi-war with France. By the way, ultimately, Napoleon comes back to power during John Adams' presidency. He does sign a peace treaty with John Adams' diplomats, and so the crisis is averted. John Adams never wanted war to begin with, but he felt like he had to be prepared for war. So the quasi-war never is just a war of words. It never turns into a war. George Washington suddenly dies in the midst of all of this. Alexander Hamilton is very angry because he wanted to be a part of this standing army, and John Adams dissolves the army because the fear of war with France is averted because Napoleon has signed a peace treaty. So now the United States' policy of neutrality has been secured with the British and with the French, and ultimately the British and the French are going to finally stop fighting one another. So I'm going to leave it there. I'll upload all of this to Google Classroom. So watch my video, read the article about George Washington's farewell address, watch the very short 5-minute video from the senator, and then I will see you guys tomorrow, hopefully. Bye.